Hey, what's up everybody? Well, I'm finding a rare opportunity to make a video, though I shouldn't be making a video. I should be doing probably a million other things. And what I'd like to talk about in this video is a number of things. First of all, I am grossly disappointed. I never should have taken that offer on a Pebbles and a Bam Bam, which I talked about in my last video. Now I have to schedule these all to come out in August since I don't know what I'm going to be doing in August, but I might not be making videos. So could not be more disappointed. I wish I could send them back with, Pebbles and Bam Bam, because that clearly is not a 1/6 scale doll. In fact, this is closer to being, this is 1/6. This is about an 1/8 or something like that. And this is clearly a 1/5 scale doll. And I wish I could send them back, but obviously I've invested too much. I made them the garment that I've always fantasized about putting them in. Some sort of a diaper slash panty. If you really were disgusted by them wearing diapers, you could say that it's underwear, and it's made with felt and pinking shears, which is how their outfits are made. Okay, I made blue for him, pink for her, and that was the color of the diapers around the time of that movie, 91 to 94-ish, especially in 92 when my sister was a baby. She had pink diapers, just like Pebbles, and the boys had blue. And so, I can remember thinking that I'm so glad that I was born in the 80s, and of course they went back to this, just having all white diapers, because they were probably selling several times the number of blue ones as pink ones in the bigger sizes. And I can remember being so grateful that, I was born in the 80s when at least diapers could still be gender neutral and white. But they always had the option to buy white. So, made felt panty or diaper, because she was supposed to have some sort of a black skirt, and he didn't have anything, so I didn't really like that. But I'm disappointed in their head size, because that clearly is like a 1/5 scale head, if not maybe even a 1/4. It's so big. But what that means is that they're more like toddlers on a 1/5 scale than, grade schoolers on a 1/6 scale, like Anakin Skywalker. But so what that means is like the equivalent adult male should be around 14 or 15 inches tall instead of a 12-inch Ken doll. So you live and learn, and I wish I would have done the math better and realized that 8 inches tall would mean their heads were huge. So I always wanted to put diapers or panties on them, but unfortunately, I'm finding out that to be on the 1/6 scale, they would need to be, more like a Kelly doll, which they later made. Anyway, enough about the dolls and the Flintstone movie, and, how disappointing they are in not being proportional to a Barbie doll. But I would like to talk about, I want to title this video Side Characters, and I don't think I want to show it, but you know how I make those cute little books, that I was showing a year ago? I'd like to get it out and show it. I made a book, and I take a lot of liberties when I make these books. Let's see. What would it take to even make this? I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to show the books that I've made. And as you can see, let's see, I don't want you to see my real name, but this is one about As Told by Ginger. It's about them getting a cold. See, there's Ginger. And let's see. There's Carl getting a cold, and Macy handing him a Kleenex. And in the beginning, let's see, you have, let's see, him standing on his head, but before that, let's see what we had. My favorite page was Blake Grippling with his telescope, which kind of motivated me to want one, and Brandon Higsby with his brother in their swimming pool and their pet monkey. Well, I don't know what I would do if someone found them, except be very embarrassed and ashamed. And this one, Howard DeVille gets very ill. And I don't want you to see my name, but let's see. It's a shorter book. And it's just all about Howard DeVille getting a cold. So you gotta be careful. There's Harold giving Angelica a cookie and a cold. There's Phil and Lil. Then there's Betty and Howard. And he's got a cold. So, I have many of them. Some of them have Cedric. My favorite ones, that is. But, so, you know, I just love to make those books. Let's see, and this was a Flintstone picture I did years ago. So a lot of books, but a lot of shame, you know, because it's not something I like for people to see. I have a lot more pictures than that. But what I want to talk about is how side characters, and how I hate it when people think that they can just remove the side characters and you're left with a show that's just as good. You know, like you can have a reboot. Like, I don't really know about this Flintstone movie. I don't know much about it. Oh, and John Goodman was Fred Flintstone. I couldn't think of his name to save my life. They had Roseanne Barr, I think, as Betty Rubble. See, that's what I mean. So many of these cartoon characters have the same names or similar names. You know, Betty on Rugrats, Betty on the Flintstones. Like Barney the Dinosaur, Barney Rubble. You know, and so on and so forth. So many characters with those common names. Judy Jetson, Judy on Doug, etc. So what I want to talk about is, you know, side characters and how they can be just as important as main characters. And when you think you can reboot a series and, you know, remove the side characters, like as if they don't really matter, you know, just as long as the main cast is there, you know, like Sophia the First, just as long as she and her siblings are there and her mom and dad, it doesn't matter about Cedric. Well, that's as far from the truth as you can get. In fact, he's my favorite character to draw. I would only force myself to draw the others so that I could draw him. And, you know, I didn't feel similarly about Howard DeVille. But upon further review, I'm finding that the two had a lot in common. Almost the exact same nose. You know, almost like Howard DeVille was like a classy, cheapo version of Cedric before he existed. Almost like he inspired him, the design. So, side characters, you know, you can't just remove them and think, you know, that it's just as good, you know, if not better, or, you know, and it's like, the more you try to remove them, or downplay their importance, the more it makes me like them or think about them. And the more I think about Howard DeVille, the more, you know, there actually was a Cedric on Rugrats. And it was in that one episode where they have cousins. And it's all about Phil and Lil. And basically Cedric, you know, they're British cousins that are just like Phil and Lil. And Cedric is like the father of that family. And he reminds me a lot of Cedric on Sophia the First with a mustache. And he's basically the Howard DeVille of the family in Britain. And Howard DeVille, you know, he wears purple and he's just kind of sissified and has a small mouth and a long nose, round ears, and he looks like he has horns, his hair. And now that I think about his last name being DeVille, which contains devil, and he has horns. So, removing side characters only makes me think about them more. And I found this kind of shocking. I mean, every day you learn something new. But those fans of the show that cannot accept what I've been saying about Angelica. Well, I am totally blown away by the fact that they had an animosity or resentment, not towards her, which would be proper, the correct animosity that you should have towards a bully that, hurts babies in various ways, pretty much emotionally, not physically, because I can't show that. Steals from babies, is greedy. The animosity that you should have is toward her. Well, instead, they have animosity towards, the few characters that I actually liked because they were male and they came along and in various ways put her in her place. Whether it's Timmy McNulty, whether it was Harold, killing her with kindness and fatness. But I like those characters because they show the contrast, that not all 3-year-olds are girls like Angelica on the show. But the only thing I dislike is the overuse of red hair. I think the hair colors, I have to draw the line at certain things. Like I will not color their hair green or blue or purple. Instead, I switch it to gray or black or, a more normal color. And one thing I found that I enjoy doing is, like for Harold Frumpkin, I make him, to offset the ridiculous overabundance of red-haired boys on the show. But oddly enough, Marley was the only red-haired girl. I sort of tweak the color to make Harold Frumpkin more of an auburn-haired kid, curly auburn hair, and Timmy McNulty more strawberry blonde. So, I like to change it slightly, but that's the only thing I dislike about those two characters. But oddly enough, these fans of the show, they hated Harold and Timmy McNulty, and I never could figure that out. But I think it's because they fantasize about being her boyfriend, or they want, the male 3-year-old to be more of a self-insert that looks like them. That's my only guess. I mean, I like Harold. I like Timmy McNulty. And I always thought it would be cool if, All's Well That Pretends Well was great, but what would have been even better is if it would have been made clear that she caught a cold from Harold at school, that she was mean to everyone and her comeuppance was catching a cold from Harold. I've always liked that thought. Like, making fun of him, he's so fat and, weak or whatnot, and then she catches a cold from it. That's always been my dream. And, I just like the thought of that. I like the thought of Carl getting a cold on his toe by Ginger because, I always saw them as antagonists, both him and Hoodsy. Because he's wearing dark brown and Hoodsy is wearing dark purple. And so the color does go with them being an antagonist. And the way I saw it was very odd in As Told by Ginger. I saw Ginger and her friends as the protagonist. I saw Courtney and Miranda as antagonist. But then I also saw Carl and Hoodsy as antagonists in a different way. Courtney and Miranda were the antagonists she faced at school. But then she came home and Carl and Hoodsy were the antagonists. And so I don't know what that would make Blake and Brandon. I like them a lot. But they always wore blue, more like a protagonist. So I guess they were a protagonist in the subplot. I don't know what you'd even call that. The foil of the antagonist, kind of like Susie in Rugrats, where they're not the protagonist, but they foil the antagonist. So I guess I guess that's a foil. So I guess the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So while they never interacted with Ginger very much, she didn't interact with Blake or Brandon, I like them because I saw Carl as a nuisance and an antagonist along with his sidekick Hoodsy. And I saw like Blake and Brandon because they were often rivals and would get the best of him in various ways. They were not protagonists, but more like foils. And I guess that, puts them on par with heroes in wearing blue. They both wore blue. And they were some of my favorite characters. And so, I was always rooting for Blake or Brandon in the subplots, like the one about the baby blanket and so on, things like that, like April Fools. And I don't know, I just felt sorry for Blake in particular because he was younger, and Brandon because he was just pitiful and probably gay, and just sissified, not very bright. You just had to feel sorry for those two. And so, like, it's interesting how that dynamic works. It's like, you'll have an antagonist who tends to wear purple or a dark color. And, that would be like Angelica or Cedric or Lars in Rocket Power. And then you have other antagonists that are like their sidekicks, or might be the antagonist when they're not around, because you can have more than one antagonist. And so like that would be like Miss Nettle, when Cedric wasn't around, and other bad kids that came along in these various shows. But I guess what you'd call that is a foil, when you have someone like Susie, or someone who comes along and rivals the antagonist but is not the protagonist. You know what I'm saying? They're not the main protagonist, but they help the protagonist by defeating the antagonist, coming out of nowhere and defeating the antagonist. So I was always rooting for people like that. And they also tend to wear your primary colors. So yeah, it's like I saw Carl as an antagonist. And that's why my dream, you see the common denominator is always like purple and dark clothing, and covering more of their body, more of their skin. But I've just always liked the thought of them having a cold in particular. My dream episode would be them with a cold, and, nothing else would be better. And so, like, yeah, like in Rugrats, the foils, so to speak. And the antagonist of the antagonist, or Susie, Timmy McNulty, and Harold Frumpkin. So, while people might think that you can just remove such characters and it's just as good, and that I'm still going to watch it, which I absolutely won't, it is not, I mean, once you see, I see the antagonist and minor characters as being every bit as important as the protagonist, if not more so in some ways. Because no episode was ever memorable because of a protagonist having good things happen to them, ever. Wasn't tuning in to see protagonists win friggin' gold medals. Was tuning in to see antagonists get their comeuppance in various ways. And whether the comeuppance was the protagonist defeating them or someone coming out of nowhere and defeating them in various other ways, didn't matter. I just enjoyed seeing it. And I'll go ahead and post this video.